Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War news update, first part there for the 3rd of October 2024. Let's get straight to where we normally start. Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. As Tim White says, although Russia's losses continue to slow, they're still a ridiculously high. They are still ridiculously high numbers. Now, all the caveats apply. You can find those in the description to the video below. 1,150 personnel lost is very high still. In the middle of that 1,000 to 1,300 range I normally talk about. We have 6 tanks, which is just below the daily average. 17 troop carrying AFVs, which is around about the daily average. 37 artillery systems, about double thereof. And 1 anti-aircraft warfare system. We have 58 vehicles and fuel tanks and 12 pieces of special equipment. So fairly challenging for the Russians. Not the worst of days, but you know, when you're losing that many people, you are going to be losing, what would that amount to? So about 1,000 a day obviously is 30,000 a month. Throw on another, you know, that's going to be 33,000 plus. We've probably seen more than that, up to days of 1,500 recently. So, you know, you're looking 35,000 people a month probably. And if these stats are true, and if your recruitment figures are still as high as 30,000 a month, which is really high recruitment, and then you've set conscription at 40,000 a month for the next 3 months, is that going to be on top of what, you know, are you going to be able to take 70,000 people out of the economy? Where are you going to get them from? You know, how many of those 30,000 a month you were recruiting would be part of the conscription numbers? And so it's going to be really interesting to see how well the Russians do in recruiting and to see whether these stats are truly unsustainable. We're going to come on to what Anders Puck-Nielsen said with Jonathan Fink the other or yesterday on Silicon Curtain with regard to where the Russians are at. More POW videos coming out showing the Ukrainians are still probably in Kursk and Vovchansk area on the attack. Now we have a Kursk offensive equipment tally here. I don't think I have an Andrew Perpetual loss list. I'll have another check. Yeah, not at the moment. But here's another Nalcio update for the Kursk offensive. So in summary, the Ukrainians have lost another 78 vehicles from the last tally summary, and the Russians 51. Now, remember, this is an area where the Ukrainians were attacking. This is their main incursion. Where we have seen the Russians attack in Pokrovsk, it's been a sort of 5-to-1 Russian losses to Ukrainian losses ratio. Where we've seen them attacking the Kharkiv directions, they weren't using as much mechanized equipment, which is interesting. And that was a sort of 2-to-1 advantage ratio. But a lot more infantry-led attacks. And in Kursk, we saw at the beginning, you know, the Ukrainians losing not that much more than the Russians, not a huge difference in the ratio, and that's been kind of maintained here. 131 to 200 is 1.3 to 2 ratio. So I think that is fairly acceptable for, well, I mean, that's pretty good for a place where you're mainly on the attack. However, the Russians are on the attack now in certain areas of the Kursk Oblast, and I don't know that that shifted the needle all that much. So the Russians are losing some equipment up there, but how much, you know, not as much as they are in places like, for example, Pokrovsk. And that could be because it's more dynamic and less positional. So it's very difficult to mount these huge mechanized attacks in somewhere like Pokrovsk, where everyone's sort of dug in, you know where you are. And so you're just, you know, driving a load of stuff over open fields towards the Ukrainian front lines. It's just more dynamic. There are fewer fortifications probably up in Kursk. You're fighting in a wholly different. You're doing sort of maneuver warfare, and that might give a slightly different picture as to, you know, what gets lost. Here you can see the list of the Ukrainian equipment added to that Nalcio tally there. A whole range of stuff. As you can see, a lot of infantry mobility vehicles and a few tanks and whatnot, and IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles as well. But yeah, that would signify attacking. And then we have Russians starting to lose more tanks. If you remember, earlier on, the Russians lost fewer tanks up there because they weren't really attacking, they were defending. There weren't so many tanks. Now you're starting to see tanks on here and BMPs, BTRs and whatnot to show that the Russians themselves are attacking there as well. But anyway, you can go and check that out at your leisure by clicking on the link in the description below. Now, the Russians lost a fighter bomber yesterday, a Su-25 and pilot. Don't know where and in what context, but when fighter bomber says, eternal flight and all that, it means that that plane and pilot has been lost. So Su-25 lost yesterday. That's good news for the Ukrainians. A Nebo M radar station was hit with an ATACMS ballistic missile. These are worth like 100 million or more, or around 100 million dollars. So this is an incredibly important bit of kit. The Ukrainian General Staff have reported that the destruction of this advanced radar, crucial for detecting and tracking aerodynamic and ballistic targets, significantly weakens Russia's air defense capabilities, they add. Now, they only started the war with, I think, 10 of these, according to Spravdi. Ukraine's General Staff announced the destruction of another integral element of Russia's air defense capabilities, the Nebo M radar system. And they only began the war with 10 of these. And I have seen, goodness me, I'd have to check on something like Oryx. I swear I've seen 4 or 5 of these being reported taken out. Operation, carried out with an ATACMS. They say second such system. Absolutely not. I have seen more than that. I've seen more than one other of these. So I disagree with that. I'm sure this is like the 4th, maybe 5th, something like that, because I have reported Nebos before. Anyway, I might have to get on the old ATP distilled website and do a search through my videos through an AI search. Thanks to Benny Pie, can do that. Right, okay. Ukrainian FPV drone versus a fully loaded Russian BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system. That's it there. I'm showing you this because, my goodness, this thing explodes when it gets hit and it's fully loaded. It is just a massive explosion. So you can go and check that out. I obviously can't really play that to you because I get in trouble. But yeah, that's what happens when a system with lots of explosive rockets blows up. Here we have a thermite, a dragon drone, or whatever they're called. The ones that drop this thermite, usually on trenches and tree lines. This is one dropping on an enemy tank. It's apparently the first loss of a tank in such a way. This is the 30th Assault Brigade, the Evil Peregrines, as they like to call themselves. So yeah, dropping it on a tank and the tank goes bang. Yesterday we heard about a car bomb going off in the Mariupol area. I think, well, it could well be Berdyansk, unless it's a different one. A car belonging to Vitaly Lomienko, a judge who collaborated with the Russian forces, was blown up while he was inside, according to Ukraine's military intelligence. Lomienko, a judge of the Chernihiv District Court, the Zaporizhia region, has remained in occupied Berdyansk and voluntarily cooperated with the Russian forces. It might be a different one, actually. The other one was 3 military personnel inside. So I think that's 2 separate instances of partisan activity well behind the lines. Russian artillery, this is a really important statistic. And we have heard this, I've heard different stats over the course of the last year, last 2.5 years, up and down, up and down. There have been times where the Ukrainians have been able to close that ratio gap. This claim is that the Russian artillery superiority has decreased from 8-1, so the fire rate of 8 Russian shells to 1 Ukrainian shell has now been close to 3-1, according to Ukraine defense official. And I was thinking about this because there's some statistics on manufacturing of drones, and apparently different stats, some saying that the Ukrainians are manufacturing drones at least 2-1 ratio of the Russians. And then there was this bit I'm going to share with you in a military aid video later, where someone's visited a drone manufacturing facility, and that one facility, that one company, is making 100,000 drones a month. Right? So remember, 30,000 drones a month is 1,000 drones a day, just from that one company. So this one company is producing over 3,000 drones per day for the Ukrainians to use on the front line. Now, that's one company, right? So now multiply that across all of the procurement and manufacturing that Ukraine is doing in terms of drones. And if drones are somewhat replacing artillery functionally, that one company is providing 3,300 a day. So when you look at 3-1 ratio of Russian artillery to Ukrainian artillery fire rate, you can then close that further by assuming that, and I think the Ukrainians are continuing to keep that asymmetrical advantage in terms of drone usage. You can close that ratio even further by adding on the amount of drones that the Ukrainians must be sending to the Russians every day. And most of the destruction of equipment we are seeing is from drones these days rather than artillery. Really important statistic, both of those. Now, I told you so. I did say I can't believe this isn't happening all the time. Russia's amazing air defense has added its growing total of hitting Russians. In Tambov region last week, a farmer dusting his fields from a light aircraft was suddenly fired upon. The military said it was a drone from Ukraine. The pilot was shot in the leg. And you can understand why this would happen. I mean, this looks not too dissimilar for some of the drones, some of those light aircraft drones that the Ukrainians are flinging into Russia. I would just be refusing to dust my crops or fly any light aircraft in Russia, because they must be so kind of trigger happy, on edge with regard to anything that looks remotely like a drone in the air. My goodness. And last night there were well over 100 drones sent into Russia, while likewise into Ukraine. So onto distant strikes here. Huge drone attack overnight. Russia firing more than 100 drones into Ukraine. So they fired 105 drones, Shahid type drones, into Ukraine. Only 3 managed to reach their target. So that's just insanely good. 78 were shot down. So that's about an 80% interception rate from conventional firing. 23 of them were taken down by electronic warfare, and 1 was seen heading into Belarus. So that's 102 of the 105 that were sent. That's an incredibly successful rate of taking down these Russian drones. It's just incredible. The Ukrainians are doing a magnificent job every night, if we can trust those figures, of course. Now, the worrying claim that we see here is that Russians can fire their Iskander-M ballistic missiles further than they used to be able to. 700 kilometers is no longer a problem for the Iskander-M of the Russian armed forces. It can fly in the Svagel, Kilmnik, Zmarinka, Shalgorod line, according to military officer Miroshnikov. This is not the limit, because the Russians plan to increase the range of the Iskander-M to 1,000 kilometers, and will probably achieve this gradually. And what does the West plan to do about it? The bureaucrats in Europe and the USA are still discussing it, as they have been doing for months. Now, I have said previously that the Iskander often gets used to hit the Ukrainian rear, and therefore the Ukrainians should think about doing those kind of training, like in Poltava, where that place, so here, that's Poltava, that training facility that was hit for communications, and 60 people killed, 300 injured, and it was all terrible. And you're thinking, why is that happening closer to the front line? Well, actually, it almost doesn't matter now, because they can send those Iskanders further and further, in the same way that Ukraine has been adapting the Neptune missile to be able to fire that 1,000 kilometers. Of course, we're going to expect the Russians to be doing exactly the same. So this is definitely a challenge for the Ukrainians. Russia's hit another apartment block last night, Saltivka area of Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine. So Kharkiv's been hit yet again, and it really shocking to see these residential buildings just routinely smashed up by the Russians. Another aerial bomb launched from a plane, one which won't have flown very far, probably well within range of USA ATACMS. What is the reason Ukraine cannot defend itself? And this is what Kharkiv looks like in the morning. Residential building destroyed, leaving 10 people injured, including a 3-year-old girl. The city is also experiencing power outages following the attack. Rescue operations continue in that vicinity. Just does my night in. Now, on the other hand, Ukraine had potentially a very big night of strikes. We don't often hear of the successes, and sometimes they're not as successful as you'd like, and the interception rate is fairly decent, arguably, for the Russians. Now, the Russians always claim they shoot everything down, and that's almost certainly not the case. Russia says it shot down well over 100 Ukrainian drones during the night, but news is leaking out of more hits. Ukrainian intelligence say they hit an arsenal storing aerial bombs in Voronezh. That would be good to stop things like this happening. Military airfield at Borisovglebsk, not the first time that's been targeted, was hit. It's not known if Russian planes were hit, but it's looking like there was some damage done there, and we'll come to that in a second. So Russian sources saying this night our air defense shot down 113 Ukrainian drones, which means there almost certainly would have been somewhat more than that. 73 over Belgorod, 25 over Voronezh, 14 over Kursk, and 1 over Bryansk. So not going crazy far. Voronezh isn't too far itself from the Ukrainian border. And Borisovglebsk, lots of fire coming from there. Region under attack by drones. Explosions were heard. Air defense is in operation. And last night, drones attacked Borisovglebsk military airbase in Russia's Voronezh region. Russian Telegram channel reports. It's reported that drones attacked warehouses that store carbs, the guided glide bombs, parking lots of the Su-35 and Su-34 aircraft, as well as places where aviation fuel is stored at the military airbase. Russia uses the airbase to strike Ukrainian territories with carbs. Last night, Russians complained on social media about the work of Russian air defense, large numbers of drones flying over, powerful explosions, and a fire in the area of the airfield. Satellite monitoring recorded 4 hotbeds of fires on the territory of Borisovglebsk. So we can have a look at indeed the firms here. So SBU drones reportedly hit Russian Borisovglebsk airfield, targeting these car bomb warehouses, Su-34 and Su-35 aircraft parking aprons and whatnot, the fuel storages, explosions. Actually, not aprons. I just think they park them on the runway. And fuel storage, explosions and fires reported overnight by locals. Firm data shows several fire spots, inflicted damage is still being assessed. So these ones over here could well be to do with the airport, could be that drones were shot down before it got to the air base. Same for over here, although that could also be an air defense installation. And here is the air base itself. We'll have to wait and see what the satellite imagery shows, but certainly there's a lot of fire coming from that area. There's a lot of explosions, and it looks like something has been damaged. Belgorod was woken up last night to some significant explosions going on there. Whether that's air defense being successful or not, don't know. So there's going to be a lot of information probably emerging throughout the day concerning that really widespread attack by the Ukrainians there. So we've been waiting for a sort of another massive attack, and that seems to be it. Now, another important event took place last night. A Russian base in Khmeimim in Syria, in the Latakia province in Syria, was targeted by the Israelis last night, it appears. If so, this would be the first. Well, we have seen some Russian... more sort of Iranian targets, haven't we? Iran has used this base as an alternative when unable to send planes to other airports in Damascus and central Syria. This is really important, potentially. Slowly, the civilized world wakes up to the fact that Russia's red lines exist only in fairy tales, says Spravdi, and I think this is not a bad point here. Israel has just decimated Russia's Khmeimim airbase in Syria, an attack consisting of 30 missiles that Russian air defense was powerless to stop. Now, there are claims that it didn't take out the airbase, but took out warehouse storages of Russian or Iranian missiles. Thomas Tyner interprets it as this: Israel, we are neutral in the Ukraine-Russia war. Russia, cool. Hey Iran, if you want to kill Israelis, feel free to use our airbase in Syria to bring your missiles to Lebanon. Lesson: Russia always backstabs everyone. Russia only respects countries that bomb Russia, is how he sees that. So this is the Russians facilitating Iran getting weapons to the area that are eventually used on Israel, and Israel hitting that Russian airbase and taking out those weapons. And of course, this will mean that either Russia becomes much more confrontational with Israel, and Israel's more likely to help out Ukraine with weaponry, although they're involved in very much a war at the moment, and so they're probably not wanting to give much to Ukraine, but they might help with intelligence satellites. Well, I don't know. But also by taking out Iranian weapons here, you are dwindling the Iranian stocks, which means they're less likely to be able to get weapons to Russia because they need them themselves. They've had them taken out. So this is potentially useful for Ukraine in several ways. And also you might get Russia then bringing out forces to Syria to replace or to get involved out there even more, and that takes away from forces they have in Russia or in Ukraine. So it'd be interesting to see what effect that will have on the war in Ukraine. Now, talking about striking deep into Russia with Western weaponry, the AFU can strike, so the Ukrainian armed forces can strike 261 military facilities in Russia if the West allows long-range missile strikes on Russian territory, according to Der Spiegel. So we know that Zelensky provided the US with a number of targets, a list of targets that they would like to hit with ATACMS. And the Americans said, oh, you've got your own stuff, and, you know, there's only 10% of the aircraft left, and, you know, keep it how it is, thank you very much. Well, actually, I think it would be incredibly advantageous for the Ukrainians if they were able to use Western weapons to strike those targets. Among the targets are large arms depots and Russian military bases. That should significantly complicate Russian military logistics if they were able to strike them. And indeed, we've heard now Mike Pompeo saying that Western weapon use restrictions for Ukraine are militarily silly and strategically stupid. The ex-CIA chief condemns limitations on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons and dismisses escalation concerns. And I think, it's good to have someone who's been associated with the Republican side, a Republican come out and say this. I think is useful for Ukraine, so that you can see bipartisan support for lifting restrictions. Now, Rob Lee's quoting from Washington Post article that talks about how, I don't know if it says it in this quote, but I believe there's the idea that not being able to strike deep into Russia has led to certain situations like this. So soldiers from several units, the article says, along the front have described improved Russian tactics this summer that combine their advantages into powerful attacks that Ukrainians have struggled to counteract, even as they achieve local victories. Enemy troops are storming the battlefields in small teams that minimize detection and make return fire difficult, backed by superior quantities of artillery and drones. Russia has also improved its battlefield communication, helping coordinate attacks. While losses are staggering, Ukrainian soldiers have said the Russians have the numbers to keep up the pressure, and Western aid isn't making up the equipment deficit. Quote, they don't spare people, and their men are forced to move through those paths. And in the last place where we were working, there's a crossroads completely littered with bodies. And they keep coming because they have orders, he said. There's already a mass of them. Everything is black with corpses. So it goes to this idea that we've heard so often that the Russians are losing tremendous amounts of people, but they are making adaptations. They are improving in the ways. Communication is an interesting one because at the beginning of the war, it was known that they were having to use like Telegram to appeal for airstrikes. Their radios were either non-existent or compromised, and this is, if you remember the beginning of the war, they had to move some of their higher ranked officials close to the front lines because comms were so bad, and then they got taken out by snipers and things. Like, that's how close they were. And so it's long been an issue, but it appeared to have improved it. And so this is worrying. However, then you look at the sort of bigger picture here. So Dimko Zlutenko here says, here is how much Russia has advanced in 1 year. So this is 1 year of advances. Bear in mind, they've lost up in Kursk over here. So that then counteracts pretty much that. For a country of their military might, it's nothing. Like, for Ukraine, it's thousands of lives lost, heroically protecting Ukrainian freedom so that war is somewhat contained. No conclusions, just facts. as there is a discussion, my take is that even though those advances could have been stopped, moreover, Ukrainian lives could have been saved just if more military aid would arrive in Ukraine to fight against Russia, the strongest enemy on the continent. Russia is being extremely stupid in the way that they wage their war. They're much richer and much stronger militarily than Ukraine. They build their own navy and aviation, even effing glide bombs. Russia is now losing. Sadly, we are the ones paying a deadly price for it. And I broadly agree with that. Like, they have lost phenomenal numbers of troops, and there are numbers here. In the past 12 months, Russian casualties were 375,000 troops for capturing these small areas on the map highlighted red. And we have to accept, says Zhluktenko again, we have to accept that Russia can keep the same tempo and replace losses with the same level of relatively untrained troops for a couple of years more. Personnel is not an issue for the Russian army. I'd slightly disagree. I think it genuinely is an issue, which is why they are getting people out of prisons. Now, you can say as long as they can keep doing that, then that's fine. But, they are getting desperate. And I am not sure they're going to be able to maintain that recruitment level with the ease that they have been. And it hasn't been easy so far. To the point where Anders Puck Nielsen, I'm trying to join all these ideas together. I'm not trying to be overly positive for Ukraine. Ukraine are in trouble, right? They are suffering on the front lines, and they don't have as big a population and all the problems that we know Ukraine has.
Those things, but
there is this.
We don't know how long the Russian economy will be able to continue at this pace, but I think if we take the rising inflation and the problem they have with a manpower shortage, and we combine that with the fact that over the next year, the stockpiles of old equipment that they can repurpose are going to start run empty, then I think it's pretty clear that it is going to decline, the capability of the Russian army, and then the discussion is how quickly is that. But I think once the war is over, that's my guess. I think we will look back at the war and say that the spring of 2024 was the peak of Russian strength, and that that time just before the Americans finally approved the assistance package and Western aid again started, really coming into Ukraine in big quantities. I mean, that was the peak sort of Russian strength comparative to the Ukrainian one.
So there's now the implication is there will now be a decline of their strength, and if that is outpacing the decline of the Ukrainian strength, and if the Ukrainians can, like I've said right from the beginning of the war, my very first videos were talking about how each passing week and month the Ukrainian forces get upgraded. I'm not talking about personnel. This is purely equipment. Ukrainian forces get upgraded, and the Russian forces get degraded. You can see this in Kursk. What are the vehicles that they're losing in Kursk? It's all the Western provided vehicles. They kind of cycled through their BMP-1s and BMP-2s. Yeah, they still have some, but you're starting to see more and more Western vehicles. They are ramping up their own production, so they're kicking out 20 Bogdana self-propelled guns every month. They are producing armored personnel, infantry mobility vehicles. They will soon be producing their own Fuchs and Lynx infantry fighting vehicles. The Lynx and the Fuchs is an APC, and they're also getting provided, like we've heard that Spain have been providing some IMVs as well, and so on and so forth. Every week, the stuff that they're getting is improving what they started this war with, right? So the Ukrainians, as much as they're struggling, they are improving their capabilities every week so that they're getting better stuff. They've got Neptune missiles coming online. Over 100 attack drones last night was not something they could do 2 years ago, right? They are constantly doing this, right? The Russians are constantly doing this. That has been the trajectory since the very beginning of the war. The Russians are not replacing their equipment well enough. they're not certainly not giving one-to-one replacement, and some of the tanks that they're bringing to the front line I don't think have the kind of optics that they need, and so some of the OBR 2022 versions of the older tanks that they're kind of refurbishing, they're actually downgrading some of their optics and whatnot. And so this movement is happening like this, and at some point there's going to be an issue for the Russians, right? Which is why I'm particularly worried that you're starting to see the odd infantry mobility vehicle coming in from China, because that's the only way that Russia can stop that decline, that degradation, gradual degradation. Now, I know there are lots of conspiracy theories, or I don't know if it's conspiracy theories, but there is a theory that it's exactly what this long, chronic, protracted war and chronic trajectory for the Russian armed forces is exactly what the Americans wanted, and that's why they've been drip feeding the Ukrainian armed forces with equipment. And we heard back in April 2022, was it? Like all that time ago, where Lloyd Austin said, "Oh, we want Russia to be unable to do this for another generation," or whatever. He was like, "We want them to be taken out, like, for good." And like the best way to do that is to have a long, protracted war, like you can argue. So I don't think that is what the US is trying to do. I think that it is what is happening, but they're being driven by anti-escalation. But the result is, at the cost of Ukrainian lives, Russia is being fundamentally degraded. And I've said this many times. Like, this form of warfare for Russia, although they are grinding on, they are taking territory off the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are losing valuable human beings. Russia is being destroyed generationally in terms of they need 140,000 people in the next 3 months. That's being taken out their economy. They're just screwing themselves over because they're in this for the long haul. There is no way out for them because this is existential for Putin, and he won't back out. He will double down. So as terrible as this is, the end result is wherever Ukraine are going to come out of this, and that's what we're arguing about, is this should happen so that Ukraine comes out up here. But irrespective of where Ukraine end up, Russia will end up screwed. Russia are screwed economically, politically, and economically and financially, politically and militarily and demographically. And their high point, as Anders Puk Nielsen said, was spring of this year. Okay, this is good news to see. I said yesterday, why is it that those 16 people getting executed, those 16 Ukrainian soldiers getting executed, is not on mainstream media? And thankfully, BBC are had a whole segment on this strike, on this execution and this war crime, talking to someone who is biggest mass execution of Ukrainian POWs since the beginning of the Russian invasion. Olga Malchevska spoke to the BBC about this on Verified Live, which is their kind of fact checker. She's a bilingual producer and reporter.
Side which fires at them, and then they fall down. Now, Ukrainian prosecutor general told us that it happened in the eastern area of Ukraine, in Donbass, between the villages next to the town of Pokrovsk, where there is a quite severe situation now. I managed to speak to Ukrainian prosecutor general, and he told us that they believe it is the biggest execution of Ukrainian surrendered soldiers since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion.
The video shows how, under control of the enemy, the captured people came out of the forest plantation. After they lined up, the opposing party deliberately shot them with firearms. The wounded, who were showing signs of life, were killed at close range by an automatic weapon. We investigate every such report we receive about possible war crimes, and we open criminal proceedings just after we receive this information. Summary execution of prisoners of war The people in the video laid down their arms and did not resist. They were under full control of the enemy. And from that moment on, they are prisoners of war and
it's a war crime, and it's sickening. It's a sickening war crime. It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. So I'm happy that the BBC have showed that, and I think it should be widespread. I think for these absolute numbnuts, and I really want to swear, but people like Donald Trump Jr. and David Sachs and all these kind of Russian appeasers and I see them flooding like Twitter and whatnot with their anti-Ukraine stances. I want them to see this, and I want them to fricking answer why they are continuing to effectively support Russia. I think it's absolutely disgusting. The Russians have done this time and time and time again, and why are we not seeing it? Why are we not seeing much more widespread condemnation of what they are doing? And another example is this. So this is right. You talk about what's going on in Israel, and as terrible as all of that is, and all these different ways, and then forget that actually that kind of stuff's been going on for 2.5 years in Ukraine. But because it's kind of old hat, it's boring, like for their readers, not clickbaity enough, stuff like this takes place. Like, this is a massive bomb. It's originally reported as a 9,000 OBU 9,000, whatever. I don't think it was. It's a smaller one than that, but it's a huge bomb, claimed to be a vacuum bomb, like slamming into Vovchansk here, which is, by the way, an absolute, it is not the city it once was, let's say. Like, that image needs to be on mainstream media news. That is a really evocative image. If you showed the destruction of buildings, civilian buildings, I know it's now the war zone, the contact line, etc., etc. But if you showed that, you get people to realise the magnitude of this war that's still going on every single freaking day. As this source says, this is what Russia does to hundreds of Ukrainian cities every day. Russia is still in the UN Security Council. Lots of Russians live in the Western countries and work as spies. Russian media still brainwash people in the US and Europe, like the people I was just talking about. How did the world allow this? And how does it continue to allow this? It just blows my mind. And another example that I think needs to be on mainstream media more. So although this is coming from the Guardian. Remember I talked to you about the same river as it comes through Russia and then down into Ukraine and then feeds into the kind of the water table, the river network. And it's being poisoned up in Russia, originally from, I think, molasses from some sugar factory or whatever. But I think it's much more systemic now. Everything is dead. Not a single organism survived. This is unprecedented. It's Europe's first completely dead river. Russia is deliberately leaking chemical waste into the Desna River with deadly consequences for wildlife. This is ecocide. It's terrible. Like, every element of what the Russians are doing in this war is horrific. And when you've got absolute dickwads like saying, oh, look, Ukraine getting this funding, oh my goodness, like FEMA's only given $750 to people. Yeah, that's the serious assistance package. What is it? Anyway, it's this federally mandated amount of money you get in a serious emergency, and it's that's what you federally mandated. That's the rules, and it's not this zero-sum game. It's not like, oh, look at Zelensky's got this super yacht, as I saw someone saying today. Oh, Zelensky gets $75 billion from the US taxpayer, gets the super yacht. Meanwhile, people in North Carolina just get $750. That is, you just don't understand how it all works, and it just frustrates me. It's like, you see these terrible things taking place and you understand what a threat Russia is, then you would understand why Ukraine is getting supported by the US and a whole bunch of allies as well. Now, as a kind of corrective to the all Russians are evil type thing, this is a really interesting and important comment from Mr. Polskaya. A bit anecdotal, but I live in Finland, pretty close to Russia, 200 kilometers from St. Petersburg. And in my workplace of 50 employees, we have 4 new Russians of 20 to 35 years old. And 30 plus of them came with all their families. So the 30 plus people have come from Russia. 4 of them are working in his place of employment. All of them hate everything to do with the Russian government and are all very vocally against the war. I thought that was interesting because I think it is too easy to tie everyone with the same brush. And I often think, look, what would I do if I was in Russia and I have my kind of liberal sensibilities and anti-Russian government approach that I have as a Russian? And of course, if you know that you're going to be arrested by going out on the streets and protesting this, or by even posting stuff on social media, or doing anything remotely, not even a millionth of what I do now, right? You'd be arrested, put in a gulag or whatever, and that's you and your family done for. And the only thing, I'm absolutely positive that I would just leave the country, and I would have left the country right at the beginning of the war. And so we must remember that an awful lot of people did leave the country who are vocally against the war. I know that there are probably people, I know there's someone who, Louis Plume, who is on the threads, who's married to a Russian, who I think has pretty similar views here. And, you know, there will be a lot of Russians who are very, Gary Kasparov is a great example, who are very vocal about what Putin and the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And it is easy to tar everyone with the same brush, but we must be a little bit more nuanced as well. Anyway, thank you for watching. Really appreciate your support. Take care, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon.